The sun was just beginning to set when Mrs. Langley stepped out of the small grocery store, her arms full of bags. She had lived in this neighborhood for over 30 years, knew almost everyone by name, and never once had trouble with the law. But today, that changed. As she reached her car, 2 police officers approached her. Their expressions were firm, their voices sharp. "Ma'am, we need to check your vehicle." Confused, she hesitated. "Is something wrong, officers?" she asked politely. One of them, a younger man with a rigid stance, simply repeated, "Step aside, ma'am." Without explanation, they began searching her car, opening the trunk, rifling through her belongings. Mrs. Langley's heart pounded. People in the parking lot had started watching, whispering. She could feel the heat of embarrassment rising to her face. "I don't understand." "I haven't done anything," she said, her voice trembling slightly. But her words were ignored. Then, one of the officers made a call. Whatever was said on the other end of the line made him shift uncomfortably. Just minutes later, a sleek black car pulled up to the scene. The door opened, and out stepped her son, Police Commissioner Langley. His face was unreadable, but there was a storm behind his eyes. The officers stiffened. The crowd fell silent. Mrs. Langley, still shaken, looked at her son, hoping for answers. He took a slow step forward, his voice calm but firm. "Would someone like to explain to me why you're searching my mother's car?" The officers exchanged nervous glances. What happened next would change everything. The younger officer, the one who had been leading the search, cleared his throat and straightened his posture. "Sir, we received a report about a suspicious vehicle matching this description," he said, avoiding eye contact with the commissioner. Commissioner Langley's expression didn't change, but there was a noticeable weight in the air now. He glanced at his mother, standing there with her arms wrapped around herself, still shaken. He knew her well enough to see that she was more than just confused. She was hurt. "A report," Langley repeated, his voice measured. "From who?" The officer hesitated. His partner shifted uncomfortably. "It came in anonymously," the younger one admitted. Langley took a deep breath, his sharp eyes scanning the area. The small crowd had grown, and whispers carried through the air. His mother, a woman who had spent her life teaching at the local school and volunteering in the community, was being treated like a suspect in front of people who had known her for years. He turned his attention back to the officers. "So, you searched my mother's car, without cause, based on an anonymous tip." Neither officer spoke immediately. The silence that followed was heavier than the moment before. Mrs. Langley's eyes darted between them, still waiting for some kind of explanation. Then the older officer, who had been quiet this whole time, finally spoke. "Sir, we were just following protocol." Langley let out a slow breath. He wasn't the kind of man to raise his voice, but he didn't need to. His authority was in his presence. "And what exactly did you expect to find?" Again, no answer. But there was something else now, an uneasiness in the officers' faces that told Langley there was more to this than they were letting on. Commissioner Langley studied the 2 officers, his years of experience telling him there was something they weren't saying. His mother was still rattled, gripping her purse tightly as if it was the only thing keeping her steady. He reached for her arm gently, a silent reassurance, before turning back to the officers. "You didn't answer my question," he said, his voice controlled but firm. "What exactly were you looking for?" The younger officer swallowed hard. He had started this search with confidence, but now, under the weight of the commissioner's gaze, he seemed unsure. His partner glanced around, perhaps realizing that the growing crowd was also waiting for an answer. "Sir, we were informed that the vehicle was involved in suspicious activity," the older officer finally said. "We had to respond accordingly." Langley's jaw tightened. It wasn't just the lack of a straight answer that bothered him. It was the way they were choosing their words carefully, like there was something they were trying to avoid saying. He had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize when officers were hiding details. He turned to his mother. "Did they tell you anything before they started searching?" Mrs. Langley shook her head. "No, they just told me to step aside. Her voice was steady, but there was a sharpness in her tone now. She was no longer just confused, she was angry. And Langley understood why. He looked back at the officers. So, an anonymous tip comes in, no evidence, no reasonable suspicion, and you decide to search my mother's car in public, without even explaining why? The younger officer opened his mouth as if to respond, but before he could, a voice from the crowd spoke up. This isn't the first time they've done this. Langley turned toward the voice. A middle-aged man stepped forward, his face tense. They've been stopping people all week, searching cars, asking questions. People who've lived here for years. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Langley's eyes narrowed. Now the situation was bigger than just his mother. Something else was happening in this neighborhood, and these officers weren't acting alone. He looked back at them, his expression unreadable. Who gave the order? Neither officer answered right away. The older one shifted uncomfortably. The younger officer, now clearly nervous, glanced toward his partner before looking away. Langley took a step closer. Who gave the order? The tension in the air thickened. The crowd fell completely silent, waiting for the response. But the officers didn't speak. They didn't have to. Their hesitation was an answer in itself. Something wasn't right, and Langley was going to get to the bottom of it. Langley could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. The officers stood stiffly, their silence stretching too long. The crowd, now fully invested, murmured in hushed tones. Mrs. Langley stood beside her son, her hands clenched tightly around the strap of her purse. Then finally, the older officer spoke, his voice low. "Sir, we were just following instructions." Langley narrowed his eyes. From who? A beat of hesitation. The younger officer glanced around, as if checking for someone watching. The directive came from higher up, he admitted. His voice was quieter now, less sure. "We weren't given details, just told to stop certain vehicles and search them." Langley's heartbeat quickened, but his face remained unreadable. He had seen cover-ups before, but this was sloppy. His mother, a retired schoolteacher, was the last person who should have been targeted, which meant whoever gave the order either didn't know who she was or didn't care. He took a slow breath, his mind racing through the possibilities. He needed to find out who was behind this, but first he had to make sure these officers knew exactly what they had done. "You do realize," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "that you just violated a citizen's rights? That you searched a vehicle without cause, and that you did it in public, humiliating someone who has done nothing wrong." The younger officer dropped his gaze. The older one's face was set, but Langley could see the doubt creeping in. They knew they had crossed a line. Then, from the corner of his eye, Langley noticed something. A black SUV parked just down the street, engine running. The moment he turned his head toward it, the vehicle pulled away, disappearing around the corner. Someone was watching. Langley clenched his jaw. This wasn't just about his mother. It wasn't just about a mistake. There was something bigger at play. And whoever was pulling the strings, they weren't done yet. Langley's eyes lingered on the spot where the black SUV had vanished. His instincts told him this wasn't random. Someone had been watching, waiting. He turned back to the officers, his patience thinning. "You still haven't told me who gave the order," he said, his voice sharper now. The older officer shifted uncomfortably, but held his ground. "Sir, we don't have that information. We only receive assignments." Langley studied them carefully. He had dealt with enough cases to recognize when someone was holding back. Before he could press further, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. An unknown number. He hesitated, then answered, "This is Langley." A pause. Then a voice, low and deliberate. "Commissioner, you need to step away from this." Langley's grip on the phone tightened. He took a slow step away from the officers and the crowd. "Who is this?" "You're looking in the wrong places," the voice continued. "Your mother was just the beginning. If you push too hard, more people will get caught in the middle." Langley's pulse pounded in his ears. His mother. The way the officers had hesitated. The black SUV. This wasn't just an overreach of power. This was something deeper. Someone wanted him to back off. "I don't respond well to threats," Langley said, his voice dangerously low. "This isn't a threat," the voice replied. "It's a warning." Then the line went dead. Langley exhaled slowly, his mind racing. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to flex their authority, they were planning something. And now he wasn't just dealing with officers following bad orders. He was dealing with someone who wanted to stay hidden, someone who had power, and someone who was willing to make things personal. Langley lowered his phone slowly, his mind working fast. He had faced threats before, but this was different. This was personal. Whoever was behind, this wasn't just warning him. They were testing him, seeing how far he would go. He turned back to the officers. "I need to see your orders," he demanded. The older officer hesitated, but then, realizing he was out of options, pulled out his phone and scrolled through his messages before showing Langley. The directive was vague, just a list of vehicles flagged for random security checks. His mother's car was on it. So were others. Langley skimmed the list and his stomach tightened. He recognized several names. They weren't criminals. They were people in his own community. Business owners, teachers, retired veterans, people who had nothing in common, unless you looked closer. These were people who had, at one point or another, spoken out against corruption. Langley's jaw clenched. This wasn't about crime. This was about control. Someone was using law enforcement to intimidate civilians. And now, they were using his mother to send him a message. Before he could say another word, his phone buzzed again. A text. No name, no number, just one sentence. Asterisk, asterisk, you're asking the wrong questions, asterisk, asterisk. Langley's blood ran cold. He turned to the officers. "Who else has been involved in these searches?" The other officer swallowed hard. "Sir, we just get orders. But we overheard that the list came from inside the department, someone high up." Langley's mind raced. If this was coming from inside his own department, then whoever was behind it had access, influence, and the ability to cover their tracks. Just then, a car pulled up across the street, another black SUV. But this time, the driver didn't speed away. Instead, the back window rolled down. And Langley saw a face he never expected. His own deputy, the man he had trusted for years, staring right at him. No words were exchanged, just a knowing look, a silent challenge. And in that moment, Langley realized this wasn't just about intimidation. This was about power. And the person pulling the strings wasn't some faceless stranger. It was someone standing right beside him all along. Langley locked eyes with his deputy, searching for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of guilt. But there was none. The man simply held his gaze, calm and composed, as if daring Langley to make a move. A slow realization settled in. This wasn't just about corruption, it was about betrayal. Someone he had trusted, someone he had worked alongside for years, had been orchestrating this from within. The anonymous tips, the targeted searches, the threats, it all led back to him. Langley took a step forward, but before he could say a word, the SUV's window rolled up. The vehicle pulled away, blending into traffic like nothing had happened. He exhaled sharply, his fists clenching at his sides. The pieces were all there, but proving it. That would be the real challenge. His deputy was careful, smart. He had influence. And Langley knew that if he made the wrong move, more innocent people, maybe even his own family, could get caught in the crossfire. He turned back to the officers. "This ends now," he said, his voice low but firm. "No more unlawful searches, no more silent obedience. If you see something wrong, you speak up. Understood?" The younger officer nodded quickly. The older one hesitated, then gave a small nod of agreement. Langley knew it would take time to root out the corruption, but this was the first step. His mother placed a gentle hand on his arm. Be careful, she whispered. Langley looked at her, then back at the street where the SUV had disappeared. He wasn't walking away from this. Not now. He had seen the face behind the curtain, and one way or another, he was going to bring the truth to light.